Good afternoon. I'm Luisa Tondelli, the Scientific Attachée at the Embassy of Italy in London. Welcome to the 6th Italy Restart event organized online by the Embassy of London about the COVID-19 themes. I'm happy to leave the floor now to the Ambassador of Italy in the United Kingdom, Raffaele Trombetta. Please, Ambassador.
Thank you very much, and welcome to all our participants to this webinar. As Professor Tondelli was saying, this is part of a series of events called Italy Restart, where we are presenting, different aspects of the Italian life, culture, but in this case also we have the support of some of our scientists on some very important subjects. So let me first of all thank the two panelists, Guido Rasi, who is the Executive Director of the European Medicine Agency, and it's nice to have him back in London, even if in a virtual way, hopefully soon enough also in a physical way. And Sergio Bonini from the Institute of Translational Pharmacology, National Research Council of Italy, Rome, and also is a member of the Scientific Board of the Embassy of Italy in the UK. And of course, our two moderators, Luisa Tondelli, who is the Scientific Attachée at the Embassy, and Kito Fusai, who is the President of the Italian Medical Society of Great Britain. The pandemic, needless to say, has heavily affected our lives. We are trying to gradually resume our activities. The Prime Minister today, Boris Johnson, he announced some measures that will be effective from the 4th of July as a way, to start to go back gradually, as I say, to our activities. In Italy, we are in phase 3, but the message that still has to be stressed, has to be underscored, is that there is no room for complacency. The virus is still out there, and we should never believe that it's over. The crisis, it's over. So it's very important to be vigilant, to take all those measures to prevent a resurgence of the epidemic. That would be a disaster. Well, at the same time, of course, the effort to find the vaccine are going on. Italy and the UK are actually on the front line for a coordinated effort at the national and international level. And of course, we do hope that those efforts will soon lead to a breakthrough. As I say, there was an important international conference that was, let's say, organized and led by the UK Prime Minister at the beginning of June. Italy has been on the front line for the ACT accelerator on vaccine, but and universities in the UK and in Italy, and companies are working heavily on this. On the other hand, researchers and clinical professionals are tirelessly working to discover more effective therapies. And this is the topic that we will be discussing today. And I want to thank once again our panelists for being available and for sharing their expertise and their experience on these very important subjects. So I know that it's going to be a very interesting session. We will learn a lot. I personally will definitely need to learn more on the subject. So once again, I want to thank them for joining us, and I'll give the floor back to you, Luisa. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you, everyone. Can you hear me? Yes? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. So it's my pleasure to be here today with all the attendees, to which I would like to thank them for their participation. You will be able to submit your question in a Q&A session that I will activate after the two main presentations. I will be happy to moderate the debate together with Professor Kito Fusai, the President of the Italian Medical Society of Great Britain, and also a member of the Scientific Advisory Board of the Embassy. Professor Fusai is a consultant surgeon and clinical lead for hepatopancreatobiliary surgery in the liver unit at Royal Free Hospital. And since 1999, he has been working in several centers of excellence in UK and abroad, including the King's College Hospital in London and Nagoya University Hospital in Japan. And now let me introduce our two panelists. They are both from Italy. They have a degree in medicine and surgery and with a specialization in internal medicine, allergology, and clinical immunology. Sergio Bonini will be our first speaker. He is a professor of internal medicine and a research associate at the National Research Council of Italy in Rome. He is also a member of the Scientific Advisory Board of the Italian Embassy in London. His scientific research activity has been very intense in his career, including approximately 500 publications with an H index of 65. And he's been part of several international expert boards, including the European Medicine Agency, and he is also part of the expert board panels at the Ministry of Health and the Italian Drug Agency. Our second speaker will be Professor Guido Rasi, the Executive Director of the European Medical Agency based in Amsterdam. He began his second term in 2015 after the first one started in 2011. And last year, he was elected chair of the International Coalition of Medicine Regulatory Authorities for a term of 3 years. Before, he has been the Director General of the Italian Medicine Agency from 2008 to 2011, full professor of microbiology at the University of Rome, and has previously worked in research for almost 20 years at the National Research Council of Italy, being author of more than 100 publications. So I would like to ask to Sergio Bonini first, if he can start with this webinar with a short description of the basic principle of drug research and development, to be followed by an overview of the ongoing trials worldwide related to COVID-19 infection. Sergio, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Luisa, for your introduction, and I'm very grateful to you and to the Ambassador Trombetta for the invitation to be part of this series of webinars. I would like to start by saying that no other disease has ever created such a ferment in the scientific community as COVID-19. In an article written in collaboration with Giuseppe Maltese from the Epsom and St. Helier Hospitals and King's College, we counted on PubMed more than 11,000 papers published since the beginning of the year. Just before this webinar, I went again to PubMed, and now the number increased to 25,000. So it almost doubled in 1 month. However, when we confine the search to treatment, out of the approximately 500 papers, if we confine the search to double-blind or control and randomized clinical trials on large population, the only ones that can provide enough evidence for the efficacy and safety of drugs used in COVID-19, I think that the number of papers can be counted with one hand. In fact, after the first negative trial on lopinavir-ritonavir, which failed to meet the main outcome of the paper, I think there is just only one paper, double-blind, placebo-controlled, and randomized that has received attention and could receive attention and provide nice results. This is on remdesivir, which produced some significant effects in the subject, over 1,000 subjects tested. However, the main outcome was the days needed to remission, which changed, which were 11 in the drug, in the interventional arm, and 15 in the control arm. So it was significant, but not so impressive. So I think that the treatment, the therapy of COVID-19 did not follow with the same speed the epidemics. However, I think we can be hopeful to have some better results in the future. In fact, if we look at the major registries, the main registries for trials, that's the WHO, clinicaltrial.gov, and the UDRA-CT, we find almost more than 1,000 papers on more than 1,000 ongoing trials with different drugs. There are two major categories of drugs that are being tested. The first one are new drugs specific for COVID-19, which are based, for example, on the structural analysis of molecules which are able to block either the proteins of the virus or the receptors of the immune cells. These drugs are specific, but unfortunately it will take time, even if regulatory bodies can adopt special marketing authorization approval pathways. It will take time before having these drugs available, as for vaccines. So the attention of research workers mainly was devoted to some drugs, the so-called repurposed drugs. Drugs which are on the market with another indication and which are used in COVID-19 in the assumption that they can be effective also on this disease. I would like to divide and classify these drugs in three major categories, depending on the phase of the disease. As you know, COVID disease starts usually with a viral infection. The symptoms are usually mild, or the subjects can be asymptomatic and usually are not hospitalized. The disease can stop, but can progress to a second phase, which is called pulmonary phase, because the major character feature of this phase is to present an interstitial pneumonia. Depending on the severity of this phase, the presence of the pneumonia and the level of saturation of oxygen, we have mild, moderate, or severe forms. But the disease can also progress to a third phase, which is called the inflammatory phase, where there is a cytokine storms, a very severe inflammation, systemic effect, and potentially also death. So we can distinguish these drugs for these three phases. In the first phase, the viral, the major objective is to stop the replication and possibly to avoid that the virus progress and the disease progress. The drug which have been used in the most studies has been chloroquine and the hydroxychloroquine. Recently, however, after some negative results and also the possibility of some side effects, even if the paper was retracted, the WHO and regulatory bodies suggested not to include anymore in trials with different arms. Then we have the group of antivirals. I have mentioned already lopinavir, ritonavir, and remdesivir, but also favipiravir and umifenvir are substances which are used in a large number of trials. Another possibility in this phase is to enhance the defenses of the subject who is infected by the virus. Interferon beta has been used both systemically and locally, but also interferon alpha and PEG interferon lambda. For the second phase of the disease, when we have pulmonary symptoms, the majority of studies are focused on some antibiotics, azithromycin, but also since this phase is not confined to the lung, only to the lung, it has been seen that the clotting system, coagulation could be affected and could result, for example, in thrombosis at the level of the lung or at the level of the central nervous system. So low molecular weight heparin have also been used in this phase. In the final inflammatory phase, the major objective is to block the cytokines which are produced in this phase. The majority of research focus on the IL-6 and particularly on inhibitors of receptor for IL-6, tocilizumab and sarilumab. But in this phase, we can also use, for example, some protein kinase inhibitors, such as ruxoltinib, but also steroids. Steroids and recently dexamethasone in some trials have been shown to be useful to block this inflammation. I would like to conclude by mentioning which are the challenges observed up to now and some recommendations for the future. The major challenge has been that the number of trials listed in registries is not the same in different registries. For example, we have 4,000 in the WHO, 2,000 in clinicaltrials.gov, only 240 trials in EUDRA-CT. And it's very difficult to collect information and make a secondary analysis because in some registries, you cannot get the information about the protocols. Another problem is that many studies were started on the basis of a compassionate use of drugs in a small population. These are not useful, and EMA says that this type of trials should be discontinued in favor of multi-center trials on large populations. So what are the recommendations for future trials? First of all, we should have multi-center trials on large number of subjects. Otherwise, we will not get enough information. The study design should be randomized. We understand that it's difficult when there is pressure for healthcare to make very nice, very good studies. But anyway, randomization is essential. The decision about the population should be stratified depending on the severity of the disease, and drugs should be selected according to the phase of the disease. For example, steroids, which can be useful during the inflammatory phase, could be harmful in the viral phase, favoring, for example, viral progression. And the outcome measure should also be different in different phases. For example, while the major objective for the early viral phase should be the clearance of the virus, and this should be the main outcomes, for pulmonary and systemic phase, it should be important how many days are needed to go to remission. But for the inflammatory critical phase in intensive care unit, I think that we need some hardened points such as survival of death. The final message is that COVID-19 requests collaboration among centers and international collaboration, transparency and sharing of data. So I would like to conclude with a message which was also in the title of the publication which you mentioned, that the quality of the trials matters more than quantity of the trials which are going on. I finished my brief introduction, but of course I am ready to expand some concepts if needed. Thank you.
Thank you. Many thanks, Sergio, for this interesting and clear scenario on the procedure for the ongoing clinical trials, and also for emphasizing the need for harmonized protocols worldwide for the success of the future COVID-19 therapies. I now have the pleasure to leave the floor to Professor Guido Rasi, the Executive Director of the European Medicine Agency in Amsterdam, located in Amsterdam, to understand how EMA answered to the COVID-19 outbreak, the public health advice, and the status of medicine availability and the future treatment for COVID-19 in Europe. Please, Guido, the floor is yours, 10 minutes as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Luisa, and thank you, the Italian Embassy in London, the ambassador, for organizing, to taking this initiative to disseminate the little, I have to say, knowledge that we collected on this new disease. And thank you, Sergio, for framing very clearly. That will facilitate my intervention. First, what is the European Medicines Agency doing for that? We are acting basically on three lines. One is to support the development, of course, of new treatments and vaccines. The second is support the member states and the European Commission to try to avoid shortages of medicine during the crisis of the COVID-19 pandemic. And thirdly, which but not less importantly, to advise on the safe use of medicines currently used in the COVID-19 or under investigation. So a little more on how we do this. To support the development of the treatments and vaccines, we basically, at the very early beginning of the pandemic, we triggered what we call our health threat emergency plan, which we already have finalized. We keep always in a drawer for this kind of event. And under this plan, we have set up an important group of multidisciplinary people, the best experts we have across the EU regulatory network, to form what we call the COVID-19 EMA Pandemic Task Force, so-called COVID ETF. Supported by this, what we try to do is to accelerate the procedure, which means rapid scientific advice. What we do mean by scientific advice is a tool we use to reach out on a voluntary basis all the people who are trying to develop some innovative approach of some whatever new medicines, and then we give them a guidance about the best methodology to gather and to generate the evidence as fast as convincing as possible. We know that a lot of time a good project have a bad methodology to produce the data, and that will be, of course, delaying for us the assessment, the understanding of the results. The second tool we have is this rolling review. What does it mean? Generally, we wait for a developer, for a new drug to be developed. They gather all the data. When the file is completed, They submit the file and we start the analysis. Now, instead, we devoted a huge amount of resources. We take each and any data, very early data coming, to achieve two things. First, to familiarize ourselves with what is coming on, to be ready to evaluate as fast as possible, and also to see if some shortcoming we can identify early, to flag to the developers to correct, to produce more data to direct in the best possible way. We already had our first rolling review with the remdesivir, one of the drugs that Sergio mentioned. And we will be probably the first authority worldwide to approve formally the proper indication in which stage of the disease for which patient this drug can benefit, giving an additional gun, an additional tool in the treatment of the symptoms caused by COVID. So this, I think, is the more or less are the two tools that are ongoing. We are working 24 hours a day. We are in connection, of course, with all the world. EMA now is chairing. I'm chairing the global coalition of regulators, trying to be aligned to have data coming from Japan, China, US, Canada, and this exchange of data, of course, is crucial to speed up and to have the most robust and consistent approach worldwide. The second is, of course, the second line is in the vaccine. What we are trying to do is to accomplish the mission impossible, which is an activity that generally takes a development that takes 10 to 15 years on average to compress in 18 months. How we are doing this, meanwhile granting, of course, the same guarantee about the safety and efficacy. We try to go in parallel with many, we allow the developers to go in parallel with many activities like the preclinical, the phase 1, the phase 2, are running in parallel, and with the rolling review, we analyze the data as they come. Of course, this will be a very challenging approach. We want to avoid hiccups like has been in the previous pandemic, when in 2010, when still some court cases are ongoing on fluad and other vaccines because of the perception that we rushed too much the decision. What is the notion we want to convey the message, and this opportunity you're offering for us are tremendously important, is that we will try to contextualize our decision. What does it mean? If we have a severe outbreak, of course, the risk benefit, the risk of the severity of the disease we have seen when the virus is circulated at very high intensity and the viral load is likely to be very, very high, we probably accept to have less data to approve the vaccine in high-risk population. If the virus is circulating less, we probably restrict initially to some population, or we might ask even more data because we are not yet convinced about the safety and efficacy. This is the kind of approach we are taking. Happy to expand. I try to stick in the 10 minutes. The other work stream, as I shared, are the shortages. This is very in a very short way. We experienced under the initial phase in Europe of the outbreak that some key medicines used in the intensive care unit were missing, mostly in some countries, and these were anesthetic, antibiotics, those intensively and acutely used for the disease, to try to treat the disease. This was caused by stockpiling, it was caused by closing of border, reducing the production because closing of the factories. And so we put a task force together to have a recording of all the available stocks in Europe and to try to circulate this among member states to provide following where the pandemic were becoming more acute. And this worked quite well. It's not our typical job, but this has been set up and with some success. And thirdly, one very important action is to give advice. As you know, we, as Sergio very clearly explained us, we do not have any specific drug so far. We are in contact with 35 developers of new drugs, and there are more than 150 more than 33 vaccines, sorry, and more than 125 new potential drugs. But no one is new and no one is approved yet. So what has been used has been very well explained by Sergio. But at the beginning, the usage of this was quite under an emotional pressure, a media pressure. For example, we had to issue a statement about hydrochloroquine, where we recommended to be used exclusively in the clinical setting because it's an old drug and we know everything about the potential side effect, and unfortunately this happened. And we were very, very concerned and very upset about the disregard of this recommendation, which caused a lot of delay in understanding the severity of the consequences and the target to be completely ineffective. Equally, we issued a statement about the Ibuprofen at the beginning. Somebody under an anecdotal report say that were detrimental for the use, which turned to be completely not real. Equally, the medicines for the hypertension, the so-called ACE inhibitors, where a lot of people are having hypertension were doubtful if to use or not. And this was, we tried to reassure, and I think this was valuable. Equally, we also discouraged the use of the habit to drink disinfectants, but this is another story. And I want to conclude about two big problems that will be that are a little bit beyond the EMA and where we cannot contribute. One is the availability. After we approve a drug, unfortunately, we cannot grant that this drug will be available at the same time for all those who will be benefiting. And there is no central authority in Europe to foster this. The Commission is trying to put action in place with some success, but this is one of the shortcomings emerged by this pandemic. The second is the fragmentation, something that Sergio already alluded. Fragmentation, the clinical trial, we strongly warned against this because the very small trial are completely inconclusive. And instead of having had 11,000 trial, we had much less, 100 trials well run. We would have the answers probably a couple of months in advance. So I completely conclude on the note with Sergio. I join voices that we need to avoid fragmentation. We need more collaboration. We need to have a net of multi-center, a net of clinical center ready to go, ready to start, coordinated from a central body in Europe, as much as we need for the research. And with this, I make myself, of course, available to cover whatever I know and you might be curious to know. Thank you very much, Luisa. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Sergio and Guido. And the floor is open, but before we give the chance to our audience to ask you questions, I wanted to have the privilege to ask Sergio and Guido one question. So I'll start with Sergio. Sergio, you very kindly gave us an overview on the different phases of this disease, from the viral to the pulmonary and finally the inflammatory with the cytokine storm. And because of that, in theory, the end point of each trial testing a specific drugs should be relative to that phase. Now, surely you must agree that in clinical practice it might be very difficult to achieve that and distinguishing the three phases. In fact, most of the influenza trials, for instance, use a time to recovery as a main endpoint, or in critical condition mortality, as you alluded to. What I wanted to ask you is, there has been one of the few positive things which have emerged from this pandemic is the way to do research, which is quite unprecedented. The recovery trial has been approved, designed and approved in a very short period of time, using endpoints which have not been used before, where drugs can be added or withdrawn from the trials, with a methodology which is completely novel. But most importantly, what I find astonishing and yet positive is the way that the research community, scientific community, has been able to pull together, set up, design, and get a trial going in a very short period of time. Can you comment on that?
Yes, thank you, Kito, because you raised a very important point, which I didn't mention in my talk, also in view of the time permitted. You mentioned the recovery trials, and there is another important trials on the same type, is the solidarity trials, which was started from WHO. What is the feature of these trials? First of all, is to make the trial possible in different centers and in a condition of pressure. The other feature is so that a large number of patients can be recruited. The other feature is that instead of having the trial for one interventional drug against one comparator that can be best care or can be placebo, you compare in the different arms different drugs, so that you can have results for different drugs studied at the same time in a large number of subjects. Of course, in these trials, it's very difficult to choose, as you say before, it's very difficult to choose some outcome measures specific for a phase of the disease, because different drugs are used. And the time to recovery is has been used, for example, in this type of trials. But what I meant before, to choose an outcome measure which is relevant for the phase of the disease, is that you cannot use antivirals without making the question whether they are effective in producing a trial, a clearance of the virus. And the same, it is not useful to know how many days the people are in an intensive care unit. What is important to know in the critical phase is will they survive or will they die? So I think for single drugs, I think it's better to choose a specific endpoint depending on the severity of the disease. But I agree with you that multi-arms trials like recovery or solidarity are very important to achieve results for different drugs in a large population sample.
Thank you very much, Sergio. I now move to Guido before I come back to you. Guido, as the director of the European Medicine Agency, you must face a very difficult situation, I guess unprecedented, as you referred to earlier. You base your guidelines and your regulations primarily on evidence. And yet, here we have an evidence which is at the best scarce. We have yet some trials which have been concluded, but there is no doubt that fast-tracking trials, analyzing data and trying to publish at times big articles on the Lancet and the New England, which have opened their doors to a lot of publications have been even withdrawn because of the lack of accuracy in the data processing and the analysis. So the question is, with a very difficult situation where you do want to get data analyzed in time, but there is no doubt that making it too quick exposes us, you perhaps, to have an incomplete set of data, have incomplete studies, and yet you need to use some evidence to recommend, suggest, and obviously support, as you say, particularly recommend on the safety of these drugs. Can you comment on this? What is your view?
Yeah, no, thank you, Kito. This, I think, is a very good question in this time, because the trust in the institution at the end of the day and the trust of the people to use the drug is exactly coming how we assess the benefit risk. As I say, first we have to contextualize. So in some way, the risk of the disease is so high that you can accept very modest evidence. In some other setting is not. For example, for the viral phase, for the mild early disease, we need data, robust data to really allow the use, because there a side effect will be much more risky than the virus itself. In the other phase, we may take a different approach. What I can reassure people is that what I was very proud of the team of experts we had, that we never felt the media pressure. For example, we've been pressed by the political environment, by the media, to approve remdesivir like the FDA have done under the emergency usage. We have not done. We recommended the use, and we recommended the strict use only in clinical trials. And we do not regret on this, like the hydrochloroquine. And we do not accept just the publication. We want to see the data. As somebody said, the mantra of regulators, if I may say, is that we can say, in God we trust, everything else show us data. And this is, and we will do the same. Of course, with some contextualization, which is exactly part of the risk benefit, which is not an absolute number, it's a moving target, and we have to move along.
It's very, very interesting what you say, Guido, and reassuring, I'm sure, for the audience, that the EMA is adopting such a thorough approach in analyzing the data, not just the papers. And I will ask you a few questions from the floor. In fact, still on this topic, they asked me whether the EMA will approve the dexamethasone. Obviously, the dexamethasone, especially here in the UK, as we've been bombarded with the work done by our scientists in the UK and emphasizing the value of dexamethasone in the treatment of this drug. What is the response, Guido?
Yes, dexamethasone is already approved drug because it's a long-standing drug in the market. For this usage, we have two options. We can issue recommendation because it's an already existing medicines. If some of the producer will not come to ask centrally a specific approval for the COVID usage and with the indication for COVID. Knowing that there are many producers because it's a generic drug, it will be interesting to see which regulatory tools will serve. What we certainly are keen to do, our ETF is already working to this, is to issue recommendation to clarify which phase. I think Sergio perfectly explained why and when should be used during the evolution of the disease. And what is also very important, we already experiencing some shortage of dexamethasone because all countries are going to stockpile. Well, one very important statement we are considering to do is to explain that the equivalence of corticosteroid. You know that it's not a problem for you to know, but for many it could be interesting to know that there are many corticosteroids, and for example, 4 milligrams of dexamethasone is equal to, for example, 25 milligrams of hydrocortisone, and so far and so forth. And so we will publish again the long-standing equivalence between all the corticosteroids to make sure that the people understand they can use one or the others to have the same. FDA is also considering this, and Japan, and we probably simultaneously are dealing with the dexamethasone in this way. It might come also a central approval.
Okay, thanks, Guido. Sergio, question for you, probably a quick one. They ask if there is a medicine available to regain sense of taste and smell, as obviously this has been one of the features of this disease. Have you come across any, or do you know of any?
No, I think I cannot answer specifically to this question because there are no studies which are focused on specific on these symptoms. I would say that is not the most relevant symptoms in this phase, because this has been reported mainly in the mild initial phase in subjects who are pauci-symptomatics or with minor symptoms. So I think in that phase, I repeat again, the major objective is the clearance of the virus, not the progression of the disease. So the treatment of symptoms can be just symptomatic. So you have, of course, fevers, you may have diarrhea, you may have a headache, but you can have any symptomatic treatment. But for the specific treatment, the goal should be the clearance of the virus.
Thank you very much, Sergio. One question to you, Guido, again, and I think is an interesting question. They ask whether you mentioned that the EMA allows a simultaneous running of preclinical and clinical studies in this exceptional case, which is obviously very good. But animal studies seem inappropriate in COVID-19, especially for repurposed drugs. Do we really need them?
That's a good question. I mentioned the preclinical studies only for vaccines.
Right.
And yes, for vaccines are essential because at least to know if there are some species developing immunization after the treatment with the candidate vaccine, for us is very important. For example, some of the candidate vaccine that are now in the mature developed phase progressed after proof that on the non-human primates there was a very good immune response. No, that's in vaccine. Of course, for other, it's absolutely not the case to use animal studies, even if for some viral load, for some other might be still useful.
Thank you, Sergio. Thank you, Guido. Sorry, and Sergio, this is a question which we've been asking in previous webinars, but probably no one knows the answer. Still, I'm asking you the question: are we expecting a new wave of the pandemic in the winter?
So you say that it's difficult to answer this question. So
I
not
to.
nice to ask me. I think I see the problem as in continuity. I don't think of a new wave. I am thinking it depends on how we behave during this period with non-pharmacological prevention, because the virus is present. Is not going on holidays and coming back in September after holidays. He is still present. So the question should be: can we end the transmission of the virus through non-pharmacological prevention, rather than to ask whether there will be a new wave. A new wave could be also during the summer if the end of the lockdown will reduce the attention that we must have to reduce viral spread.
Thank you, Sergio. We got a few minutes left, so I got one more question for you, Guido. And as you know, obviously, everybody's aware of the plasmapheresis, plasma exchange, and using plasma from recovered patients has been regarded as helpful. In fact, I think is one of the arms of the recovery trial as well. The question is, what is the position of the EMA with regard to plasma as a potential treatment for these patients?
Well, surprisingly, EMA will never be concerned with this treatment since it's under the blood and transfusion regulation. That doesn't come to us. However, we already had an internal discussion and position, and we know that because that is more or less the same approach that will come with the monoclonal antibodies toward the virus. We know that the plasma can certainly have a position in the therapy, with a caveat that is a transitional, so you might be reinfected or might be doesn't give you a permanent immunity. So there is a window of opportunity when you have a lot of people convalescent, providing the plasma, because you need the donors. So there is now a spike in donors, and there is an opportunity to have some of them. The plasma that can last up to 6 months, so it will not last forever. In some disease can certainly reduce the viral load. There are pros and cons. I think it's one of the many guns we have. It can be used along with the others. It's not the final solution, but in a peak of epidemic can be useful. This is our expert position. It's not my position. I replicate what I heard from my expert. It's not an official EMA position.
So the EMA doesn't have obviously any objection in this in terms of regulation, and this can be used as long as obviously the logistics for it are not straightforward, because they require an infrastructure to be used. I think we got time perhaps for one more question, and I would ask you, probably more than a question, is a guess. Vaccines remain now one of the important and probably the most important way to try and counteract the future pandemic more than the current pandemic, in fact. What do you think, to you and to Sergio, what do you think is a time scale? And I know it's very difficult. What is the time scale to get a proper and successful vaccine? We're talking about months, or we're talking about years? You referred earlier to the fact we are fast tracking. We are really accelerating the normal scientific research process, which leads to the development of a drug, of a vaccine. But just for the audience, so what do you think could be the time scale? We're talking about a year? We're talking about 2, 6 months?
Well, the technical aspect of the vaccine are progressing faster than we expected. Now we are in the clinical phase, and that, of course, is a big question mark. Assuming that things are going at this pace without showing any safety issue first, and the efficacy will take longer to have, we might have vaccines, the first doses of vaccine early next year, which Good. Means we can allow some critical population to be treated. Then the availability of large-scale doses, that is the other big issue.
Yep. And Sergio, do you agree with this time scale? Are you more pessimistic? Are you more optimistic?
I cannot add anything more because regulators are responsible for that. But I would like to stress that apart from the efforts of regulators and of researchers to have results as soon as possible, the problem is production. And the other problem is availability in different countries, because then there is the problem also of health technology assessment. It depends on the cost, it depends on the availability for different countries. So perhaps to have the marketing authorization will not be the real deadline for people to have access to vaccines.
Thank you very much, Sergio. And with this, I think we are coming to an end. I want to thank you personally, both you, Sergio and Guido, for the excellent webinar. And I hand over this now to Luisa. Luisa, over to you.
Thank you very much, Kito. Thank you very much for having moderated the Q&A session. I believe it has been a very rich and interesting session, and I apologize for the question we were not able to answer to, but we tried to condense the largest number of questions we could to give you the possibility to give our speaker the possibility to reply. We have received many inputs, and so we will take advantage of this for our future webinars that will be organized in the next months, and for which you will receive information visiting the website of the embassy. I want to thank Guido Rasi from the European Medicine Agency and Sergio Bonini from National Research Council of Italy. Thank you very much for your availability and also for your talks and clear explanation of the status of the art at the moment of this fight we are facing with. A final thank goes from my side, and I think also from my colleague's side, to all attendees. Thank you for your questions. We have tried to give answer to most of them, and you will be able to see again the webinar on the website of the Embassy of Italy in London, starting, I believe, as of tomorrow. Stay tuned with the website of the Embassy of Italy in the UK for our future initiatives in this field and in different scientific fields. Many thanks to everybody. Thank you very much for your presence. See you soon on this webinar initiative. Bye-bye.